A wealthy businessman arrived to collect his child from school and was shocked to discover an African-American custodian holding his son's hand. "Remove your hands from my child immediately." The furious shout from Richard Hartwell reverberated through Winchester Academy's courtyard, drawing multiple onlookers. The real estate tycoon rushed forward like an enraged animal toward the uniformed black maintenance worker who stood beside Tommy, his 8-year-old boy. James Washington maintained his grip on the child's hand while carefully positioning himself as a protective barrier between the youngster and his irate parent, his serene demeanor a stark contrast to the brewing chaos. "Mr. Hartwell, allow me to clarify the situation," James offered. "Clarify what exactly?" Richard snarled venomously. "What reason does a maintenance worker have for making contact with my child?" "Security. Call security." Having reached 42 years of age, James had witnessed this identical scenario unfold repeatedly. The familiar expression of revulsion, the identical accusatory inflection, the immediate presumption that his proximity to a wealthy Caucasian child could only indicate something malevolent. However, this instance differed from the rest. Today, he wasn't merely another overlooked employee facing public degradation. Tommy, bewildered and scared, tightened his grasp on James's hand. "Father, Mr. James was assisting me after I tumbled in." "Be quiet, Tommy," Richard snarled, yanking his son away forcefully. "I forbid you from approaching that individual again." Surrounding parents began congregating, murmuring amongst themselves while capturing photos on their mobile devices. Principal Campbell hurried toward them, her complexion flushed with mortification. "Mr. Hartwell, please allow us to address this matter peacefully." "Peacefully?" Richard scoffed bitterly. "I discover an unknown person with their hands on my son, and you expect tranquility? This individual has no business being on school grounds." James inhaled deeply, his hands trembling slightly, not from terror, but from restrained fury that few individuals could contain. 2 decades serving as a pediatric brain surgeon prior to his downfall had instilled in him the ability to remain composed during the most critical circumstances. "Your assessment is correct, Mr. Hartwell," James responded calmly, his courteous tone catching some observers off guard. "Perhaps my presence here truly is inappropriate. However, your son sustained a head injury from his fall, and drawing upon my background as a former physician, I simply provided elementary medical assistance." The ensuing quiet was overwhelming. Richard blinked slowly, processing the phrase "former physician." Yet his arrogance overwhelmed his logic. "Former physician," he mocked. "Right, and I'm an ex-astronaut. Reserve your fabrications for gullible fools." The gathered crowd's whispers intensified. Several parents appeared uncomfortable with the unfolding scene, yet none dared challenge Richard Hartwell. After all, he contributed millions annually to the institution. James surveyed the area, memorizing each face and every expression of tacit complicity in this public degradation. Something in his gaze, a troubling tranquility, sent an inexplicable chill through some witnesses. "Your response is completely understandable, Mr. Hartwell," James stated while cleaning his hands on his uniform. "Naturally, any parent would be concerned upon seeing someone of my appearance near their child. However, understand that this exchange is nowhere near concluded." As he proceeded toward the custodial supply room, James maintained his dignified posture in a manner that deeply unsettled Richard. Something about this man defied the expected role of a submissive victim, which irritated him more than any defensive response would have. There, before all the contemptuous and pitying stares, James Washington harbored a secret so devastating that it would transform this public humiliation into the most profound justice lesson the Winchester elite had ever experienced. If this tale of prejudice and unexpected revelations moved you, remember to subscribe to witness how an ordinary custodian is about to revolutionize the established order in ways no conceited billionaire will ever forget. Word of the Winchester Academy disturbance spread through elite social media groups like wildfire. Richard Hartwell acted swiftly. Before reaching home, he had already contacted 3 school board members demanding the immediate termination of the threatening janitor. "Principal Campbell, I require a satisfactory explanation regarding your employee screening procedures," Richard barked into his phone while still in the school's parking area. "That suspicious person could have abducted my son." The following day, James entered his workplace to find a dramatically altered environment. His co-workers' glances alternated between sympathy and mistrust. Colleagues who previously acknowledged him now averted their eyes, fearful of association with controversy. Supervisor Martinez awaited him in the storage area, clipboard in hand with an official demeanor. "James, we must discuss certain concerns about your interactions with students." "What concerns?" James inquired peacefully, continuing to arrange cleaning materials with surgical precision, a practice retained from his operating room days. Multiple parents have contacted us questioning the appropriateness of staff having close contact with children, she explained, avoiding eye contact. It might be advisable for you to concentrate on administrative tasks temporarily. James nodded wordlessly. 23 years prior, he had lost his medical credentials after being wrongfully accused of malpractice during surgery. The patient, an influential politician's son, had died from unforeseeable complications. However, a black neurosurgeon from modest origins proved a convenient scapegoat when the elite required someone to blame. At that time, he had fought desperately to restore his reputation, exhausting his savings on legal representation. He lost his residence, his marriage, his standing. That experience taught him a crucial lesson. Society didn't merely punish wrongdoing, it punished those who dared occupy positions supposedly beyond their station. But this time would differ. Now he was no longer the naive young physician who believed competence and integrity could overcome bias. Meanwhile, Richard savored his triumph. During lunch at his country club, he recounted the incident to business associates, embellishing details progressively. Can you imagine? A custodian, likely an ex-convict, touching my son. Fortunately, I arrived in time. You acted appropriately, Richard, Peterson, his business partner, concurred. Such people need to understand their position. What Richard didn't realize was that James had initiated his own investigation. During nighttime rounds at the school, he had observed something noteworthy. Richard frequently arrived late to collect Tommy, leaving the boy waiting alone for up to 40 minutes. On multiple occasions, James had witnessed Tommy weeping silently in the deserted playground. Even more intriguing were Richard's phone conversations conducted near the school. James, with his surgeon-trained hearing, could discern troubling fragments. The fraudulent documentation is prepared. The audit mustn't discover this. If anyone speaks, you understand the consequences. 3 days following the incident, James received a court summons to provide testimony at the police station. Richard had filed an official complaint alleging suspicious and inappropriate conduct with a minor. James's photograph circulated in neighborhood groups accompanied by warnings about a predator at large in the vicinity. At the station, Chief Santos, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, conducted a standard interrogation. Mr. Washington, you comprehend that we must investigate all allegations involving children, correct? Absolutely, officer, James replied with the same composure he displayed when explaining complex procedures to patients' families. Actually, I'd like to use this opportunity to express my own concerns regarding the child's welfare. The officer's eyebrows rose. What do you mean? James retrieved a small notebook from his pocket, another medical habit he'd never abandoned. Tommy Hartwell exhibits consistent indicators of emotional neglect and potential psychological abuse. Panic episodes, social withdrawal, excessive fear of his father's reactions. The technical precision and medical terminology intrigued the deputy. This didn't match a typical janitor's profile. Meanwhile, Richard celebrated at home, informing his wife Victoria how he'd resolved the school issue. That man will learn to mind his own affairs, he declared, pouring expensive scotch. Victoria, however, appeared troubled. Richard, are you certain you're not overreacting? Tommy mentioned the man simply helped him. Tommy is a child, Victoria. He doesn't comprehend worldly dangers. I'm protecting our son from a potential predator. Neither realized that James had discreetly activated a recording application on his phone before each school interaction. 23 years of injustice had taught him that in a world where his word held less value than his appearance, documented evidence was his sole protection. The recordings of Richard's parking lot conversations would reveal far more than prejudiced behavior. They exposed crimes that could send the arrogant billionaire directly to prison. Each fresh humiliation only strengthened something within him that his oppressors couldn't perceive, a quiet force fueled by the very injustice they sought to impose. What these privileged individuals didn't understand was that every act of contempt was writing their own defeat. James Washington was carefully documenting every word of that verdict. 2 weeks after the police report, James Washington was conducting his evening patrol at Winchester Academy when his phone buzzed. The message came from a number he hadn't seen in over 20 years. Dr. Washington, this is Dr. Patricia Nees. I need to speak with you urgently. I saw the news. Patricia had been his resident during his Central Hospital operating days. She was among the few who had consistently believed in his innocence when he lost his medical license. Now she was one of the nation's most respected pediatric neurosurgeons and medical director of a major West Coast hospital. They met at a discreet downtown cafe. Patricia, elegant in her dark blazer, could barely contain her outrage. "James, when I saw your name in local headlines as suspected of inappropriate behavior, I nearly destroyed my phone in fury. This Richard Hartwell has no idea who he's challenging." "Patty, you understand how these situations work," James replied calmly, stirring his coffee. "The narrative has already been established. Former black doctor fallen from grace, now a suspicious janitor." "Not if you refuse to let it," she stated firmly, sliding a folder across the table. "I obtained copies of your original medical records, colleague recommendation letters, testimonials from parents of patients you saved, everything that was buried originally." James opened the folder, his eyes welling with tears as he saw photographs of children whose lives he'd saved, handwritten letters from grateful families, scientific articles he'd published in international journals, a lifetime of medical dedication erased by a single unfounded accusation. "There's more," Patricia continued. "Remember Dr. Martinez from the ethics committee who cleared you in the internal investigation before political pressure intervened? He's retired but kept all documentation. He's willing to testify about irregularities in your case." Meanwhile, Richard Hartwell basked in his success during a golf club business meeting. "Can you believe that janitor had the audacity to question my authority in front of my son?" he laughed to fellow members. Well, now he's learning his place. What Richard didn't know was that James had begun investigating the Hartwell family. Using his medical research skills and the investigative patience he'd never lost, James uncovered disturbing information about Richard's financial empire. Through public records and connections Patricia provided, James discovered that Richard's companies were involved in complex tax evasion and money laundering networks. Even more shocking, Richard's son had been hospitalized 3 times in the past year for domestic accidents, a pattern any doctor would recognize as suspicious. During his night rounds, James had systematically documented Richard's school behavior. With a small digital recorder hidden in his uniform, he captured every phone call the billionaire made in the parking lot, every disrespectful comment directed at employees, every moment of neglect toward his own son. The recordings revealed a man completely different from Richard's cultivated public image. "If those auditors discover the Cayman Islands accounts, we're finished," he whispered into his phone. "And that lawyer investigating the factory conditions, she needs silencing before causing trouble." 3 days later, James received an unexpected visitor at his home. Tommy Hartwell stood at his door alone, eyes red from crying. "Mr. James, my dad says you're bad, but you've always been kind to me. He hurts me when he's angry." James's heart broke. His medical experience confirmed his suspicions. The marks on Tommy's arm, the fear in the child's eyes, the frequent accidents. "Tommy, can you tell me what happens at home?" The child revealed a terrible pattern of emotional and physical abuse. Richard beat him when drinking, locked him in his room for hours as punishment, and constantly humiliated him by calling him weak and worthless. His mother Victoria knew everything but was too terrified to act. James immediately called Patricia. "I need you to examine a child discreetly. I suspect systematic domestic abuse." "My God, James, are you certain?" "I have 23 years of experience in pediatric trauma. I recognize the signs." Meanwhile, Richard continued his smear campaign, spreading rumors about James in school groups and pressuring other parents to avoid the dangerous janitor. He had even hired a private investigator to uncover dirt on James's past. What Richard didn't realize was that his arrogance was engineering his own destruction. Every threat, every public humiliation, every act of prejudice was being meticulously documented by someone whose patience and precision had been forged in operating rooms where lives depended on every calculated move. Patricia had assembled a discreet professional team, child psychologists, civil rights attorneys, and an investigative journalist who specialized in corporate corruption cases. All volunteers united by their outrage at the injustice James was suffering. "We have sufficient evidence to destroy Richard Hartwell on 3 different fronts," Patricia explained during a secret meeting. "Child abuse, financial crimes, and racial discrimination. The question is, how do we proceed?" James gazed out the window at the city lights. 23 years ago, he had been a naive young doctor who believed truth alone would suffice. This time, he wouldn't make the same mistake. "We want more than justice," James said calmly. "We want to ensure he can never harm anyone again." At Winchester Academy, Richard continued his arrogant routine, unaware that his every move was being watched and documented by someone who had learned that sometimes the only way to defeat a corrupt system is to use its own rules against it. But the billionaire had no idea that this simple janitor was about to teach him a lesson about real power, the power of someone who has nothing left to lose but everything to prove. Winchester Academy had never witnessed such a press conference. 24 hours earlier, James Washington was merely a janitor under investigation. Now he sat at an elegant table alongside Dr. Patricia Nees, renowned investigative journalist Michael Torres, and a stack of documents that would make any prosecutor salivate. Richard Hartwell arrived at the school parking lot at exactly 9 a.m., as usual, speaking loudly on his phone about minor problems with a troublesome employee. His arrogance evaporated the moment he saw television cameras and reporters assembled at the entrance. "Mr. Hartwell," shouted a reporter, "is it accurate that your company has evaded over $15 million in taxes during the past 3 years?" Richard's face drained of color. He attempted to retreat to his vehicle, but other journalists had already surrounded him like sharks sensing blood. "Mr. Hartwell, how do you respond to child abuse allegations against your own son?" asked another reporter, thrusting a microphone toward his face. Inside the school, James observed through the window with the same surgical calm he displayed when operating on brain tumors. Patricia stood beside him, holding a folder containing X-rays she had discreetly taken of Tommy, irrefutable evidence of multiple fractures in various healing stages. "Phase 1 complete," James murmured. "The world now knows Richard Hartwell's true identity." But the plan's true genius was just beginning. As Richard stammered denials to reporters, his phone rang. It was his accountant in panic. "Richard, the IRS is here with a warrant. They have recordings of you discussing the Cayman Island accounts." "How did they obtain that?" Richard felt his legs weaken. The recordings, those conversations he had assumed were private in the school parking lot. Suddenly, a terrible memory surfaced, the janitor always cleaning nearby when he made his most compromising calls. "That son of a," Richard whispered, the realization hitting him like a punch to the stomach. Michael Torres, the investigative journalist Patricia had recruited, approached with a satisfied smile. "Mr. Hartwell, I have here a flash drive containing 4 to 7 recordings of you discussing tax evasion, bribing auditors, and threatening witnesses. Would you care to comment?" James's strategy was devastatingly simple and completely legal. 4 months, he had recorded Richard's phone conversations on public property, the school parking lot. As a former doctor, he understood privacy and evidence laws thoroughly. Every recording had been obtained within legal boundaries. "This is a setup," Richard shouted, sweat streaming down his forehead. "You cannot use those recordings." "Actually, we can," said the civil rights lawyer Patricia had brought, calmly. "Conversations in public spaces have no privacy expectation. Considering his own words reveal crimes against child welfare, it's our moral obligation to expose them." At that moment, Victoria Hartwell arrived with Tommy. The child ran straight to James, completely ignoring his father who was being publicly destroyed mere feet away. "Mr. James," Tommy cried, hugging the legs of the man who had finally freed him from his domestic hell. "Dr. Patricia said I don't have to be afraid anymore." The cameras captured everything, the child's natural trust in the suspicious janitor versus the visceral fear he showed toward his own billionaire father. Victoria, with tears in her eyes, approached the reporters. I knew what was happening at home," she said, her voice trembling. "But I was too frightened to speak. This man," she pointed to James, "saved my son, while my husband accused him of being dangerous. He was the only person who truly cared about Tommy's welfare." The crowd of school parents who just weeks earlier had whispered about the troublesome janitor now watched in shock as the truth unfolded like a horror movie. Richard attempted one last desperate gambit. "You believe a janitor's word over mine? I built an empire. His nothing but a—" "Dr. James Washington," Patricia interrupted, her voice cutting through the air like a scalpel. "Pediatric neurosurgeon, magna cum laude from Harvard Medical School. Author of 17 scientific articles on childhood brain trauma. The man who saved over 200 children's lives before being falsely accused and losing his medical license due to political pressure." The following silence was deafening. Richard blinked repeatedly as if unable to process the information. 23 years ago, James said calmly, walking toward the cameras, "I learned that society doesn't just punish crime, it punishes those who dare occupy spaces supposedly not belonging to them. Today, I'm teaching a different lesson. True strength doesn't come from money or power, but from the patience of those who know how to wait for the right moment for justice to be served." At that moment, Richard's phone rang again. It was his partner Peterson in total despair. "Richard, clients are canceling contracts. The board wants your immediate resignation. The stock is down 80%. Richard collapsed to the ground, literally. His legs could no longer support the weight of complete ruin collapsing upon him. In less than 2 hours, he had lost his company, his family, his freedom, and any shred of dignity. James crouched beside him, whispering low enough that only Richard could hear. Next time you judge someone by their appearance, remember that sometimes the janitor can be the smartest person in the room. As Richard was taken away in an ambulance, apparently having suffered a panic attack, and later in a police car, James remained in the schoolyard surrounded by cameras, holding Tommy's hand. But the story was far from over. Because while everyone witnessed an arrogant billionaire's spectacular fall, one question hung in the air. What happens when a brilliant man wronged by the system finally decides to use all his knowledge and patience not just for revenge, but to completely transform the society that rejected him? 6 months later, Winchester Academy was a completely different place. The Hartwell scandal had become a national case study taught in law schools as a perfect example of how systematic prejudice could be legally dismantled by its own victims. James Washington no longer pushed a cleaning cart through hallways. He occupied the office that once belonged to Principal Campbell, who was fired after the investigation revealed she had ignored multiple reports of Richard's abusive behavior. The new nameplate on his door read, Dr. James Washington, Director of Child Protection and Academic Development. The irony was delicious. The man once deemed too dangerous to be around children now oversaw all their welfare at the town's most prestigious school. Richard Hartwell, meanwhile, discovered that gravity truly exists. His company had gone completely bankrupt as clients fled like rats from a sinking ship once the recordings were released. His bank accounts were frozen by the IRS. His mansion was auctioned to pay debts. Worst of all, he was serving a 5-year sentence for tax evasion, fraud, and child abuse. In federal prison, Richard discovered a bitter reality. Inside, the number of zeros in your bank account didn't matter. His arrogance and prejudice made him a perfect target for other inmates who didn't tolerate men who abused children. Ironic, isn't it? Patricia remarked during a visit to James's new office. He spent his entire life judging people by skin color and social status. Now he's learning that in prison, those distinctions mean absolutely nothing. Tommy, finally free from domestic terror, blossomed like a plant receiving sunlight after years in shade. Victoria had divorced Richard before the trial ended, regaining her courage and independence. Mother and son now lived in a modest but peaceful home, something Richard's money had never been able to purchase. Most touching was seeing Tommy running through school hallways, shouting excitedly, Dr. James. Dr. James, every time he saw his hero. The child who once lived in terror now radiated confidence and joy. James had done more than avenge himself. He had transformed Winchester Academy's entire culture. He implemented diversity programs, strict anti-discrimination protocols, and most importantly, created an environment where children from all backgrounds felt safe reporting any kind of abuse. Reinstating his medical license had been just the beginning. Universities across the country invited James to speak on transforming injustice into social change. Publishers fought for his autobiography rights. Hollywood producers wanted to turn his story into a film. But perhaps the sweetest revenge came during the annual school board meeting. The same parents who once whispered about the dangerous janitor now competed to greet Dr. Washington and take selfies with him. It's amazing how quickly people change their minds, Patricia commented sarcastically, observing the wealthy parents' blatant hypocrisy. James smiled with the serenity that had so bothered Richard on the first day. They haven't changed their opinion of who I am. They've just discovered who I've always been. Linda Holloway, the prejudiced socialite who had started the campaign against James, now avoided social events. Her own social circle rejected her, not on moral grounds, but because associating with her meant being on the wrong side of a story that had become a national symbol of justice. Winchester Academy became a model for other institutions. Delegations from private schools visited regularly to learn about the Washington Protocols, a set of guidelines James had developed to prevent discrimination and protect employees at all levels. One afternoon, while reviewing reports in his office, James received an unexpected letter from Richard, written from prison on cheap paper in shaky handwriting. Dr. Washington, the letter began, and James noticed that Richard had finally used his correct title. I know I have no right to your forgiveness, but you need to know that I have learned who you really are. Not just a brilliant doctor, but a better man than I will ever be. My son is happy for the first time in his life, and that is thanks to you. Thank you for saving him from me. James folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his desk drawer. It wasn't about forgiveness, it was about understanding that some people have to lose everything to finally see the truth. Tommy appeared in the office doorway as he did every afternoon after school. Dr. James, "Can I do my homework here today?" "Certainly, champ," James replied, clearing space on his desk. "How was science class?" "Amazing. The teacher said when I grow up, I can be a doctor just like you." James watched the boy eagerly open his books, a child who had once lived in terror, now dreaming of the future. That transformation was worth more than any revenge. 6 months ago, Richard Hartwell thought he was humiliating a black janitor. In fact, he had awakened a sleeping giant, a man who not only knew his own worth but had the patience and intelligence to prove it to the world. The lesson was crystal clear: never judge a book by its cover, because sometimes that simple janitor can be the most powerful person in the room. When someone tries to belittle you out of prejudice, remember that the best revenge isn't stooping to their level, but rising so high that they have to break their neck just to see you. Richard tried to destroy James but ended up destroying himself. James learned that true revenge isn't repaying the harm done to you, it's achieving the success your enemies could never imagine. If this story of transformation and justice touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more stories proving that in the end, truth always wins, no matter how long it takes to emerge.